Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium. It's Tuesday, April 20th of 2021. We are in the home stretch of the semester with just 3 presentations remaining after this one. And before introducing today's presenters, let me tell you just a little bit about the colloquium series. I'm Kenton Bird. I am faculty of the School of Journalism and Mass Media. And my colleague, Dan Bukovich, is one of the founders of this colloquium series back in 2001. And here is our call for proposals for the fall semester. We've extended the deadline until Friday, April 30th, and we hope that we can entice some of the panelists or presenters from that very first season to join us next year. Coming next week, our presenters will be Joanna Goss from the U of I Department of Art and Design and her collaborator Kevin Hamilton, who is the Dean of the College of Fine Arts at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And their topic is image operations. Surplus visibility in oceanic nuclear testing. And those of you who are not familiar with the geography of the South Pacific, the top photo is a satellite view of the Bikini Atoll, where the first US hydrogen bomb was tested in the Pacific. So I hope you will join us next week, as well as to submit proposals for the fall. Today, we are delighted to have 3 faculty members from our College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences, Ashley Kerr from Modern Languages and Cultures, Tara MacDonald from English, and Rebecca Scofield from History. And they are coming at the topic of popular culture, affect, and animals from 3 different perspectives. And so welcome to our panel, and Ashley is going to start things off.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having us. I know we're all excited to be here and talk a little bit about some of our new projects that we're currently working on. The title of our talk is Popular Culture, Affect, and Animals. And as Kenton said, we are coming at this from 3 different disciplinary specializations. Rebecca's in history, Tara in English, and I'm in modern languages and specifically Spanish. And so what we thought we would do today for our panel is I'm going to take a couple of minutes to introduce what we're doing, as I'm doing right now. And then each of us will take just a few moments to talk about our projects, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So again, we're coming at this from 3 different disciplines, and each of us does rather interdisciplinary work within our discipline to begin with, and from time periods ranging from the early 19th century up until the present. And really what ties our 3 papers together, or our 3 projects together, is this question of what do we learn if we look at animals in popular culture? And I'm sure all of you have noticed in the popular culture that you consume that animals are really everywhere. And so we wanted to look at that topic. And as we go through our presentations, just to give you a little bit of a guide, I think there are about 3 topics or threads that you'll see going through all of them. The first is animals as animals. So what can these animals do to affect their environment? What is life like for animals as animals? Animals as metaphor, so how people, humans, use other non-human animals metaphorically to negotiate their powers and relationships with other humans and with the world. And then also the power of popular culture to both reflect and shape society. So popular culture is often dismissed as unserious. In the case of many of the texts that we're looking at, feminine and therefore non-important. But I think as you'll see through our talks that it generally can have as large of, if not a larger effect, than more traditional scholarly or scientific texts when it comes to animals. So I specifically today am going to be talking about the Buenos Aires Zoo in Argentina. And in 1911, the Buenos Aires Zoo had over 1 million visitors, nearly 1.5 million visitors in 1 year, which made it the most visited zoo in the world in 1911. Argentine newspapers and magazines also featured an astonishing number of reports, articles, interviews, cartoons, featuring all of the non-human stars of this institution. So you can see here on the left, this is from a very, very, very popular magazine called Caras y Caretas. And this is the director of the zoo getting panther caresses, according to the caption. Here he is playing with his favorite monkey. And to the right, we've got the bear giving him a kiss on the hand. All of these are from popular magazines. Here, this is the social event of the week, or the zoo-shul event of the week as a pun. And this was that there was a baby camel born at the zoo. And then here, just two more because I love all of these images. Here's the director of the zoo bottle feeding the little baby camel. And on the right, giving cookies to the elephant at tea time. So we have, again, in all of these newspapers, and there were also short stories, tangos, all sorts of things written about these zoo animals. And so in my new project, which I'm calling Social Life, of the zoo, right, I look at both how the zoo's physical institutions, programs, and policies were determined to shape society, and also how these so-called zoo stories, to use Randy Malamud's term, were also used in the same way. In the end, these Argentine elites explicitly said that they expected the zoo to be a place to cultivate the spirit of the masses. And so what I'm trying to see is really, how did they do that, both in terms of the actual zoo and in terms of the zoo's representations in popular culture. So I want to focus specifically on gender for today's talk, just because I could talk about just about anything. And gender seemed like a very interesting way to get into this topic. So like in the US in the early 20th century, we're looking at women trying to make inroads into new places of power, workplaces, trying to get the vote, trying to establish changes to the civil code, add in divorce, things like that. It was often led by socialist and anarchist groups in Argentina, but we really do see it across a broad swath of society. Here we've got Cecilia Grierson, who is here in the darker clothing. And she's the first woman to graduate from medical school in Argentina in 1889 and founds a nursing school that then trains many others. By 1920, women had the vote in some of the provinces, although they wouldn't get it at the federal level till 1947. And then at the same time, we had reformers and eugenicists looking at the maternal body as a place of shaping future generations. So we really see the start in the early 20th century of a broad and fairly influential feminist movement in the country. So, what role did the zoo play in talking about gender? Well, I'm just beginning my investigations with this, but I'm finding all sorts of very cool information. So on the practical side, the zoo encouraged school children, both boys and girls, to come visit. And the director would often go into schools to give talks about animals, evolution even, to both genders. Here we've got a picture. The caption to this picture says something about school children getting a practical lesson in botany. And they're there at the zoo learning about some of the plants. And you can see there are numerous girls in this image. I looked at the yearly administrative reports for the zoo, and it appears it's about equal numbers of boys and girls that come on these trips every year, if not more girls than boys. And here we find that this quote that I have here, they actually, both genders carried out practical studies, preparing anatomical pieces and cutting tissue for under the microscope. So the zoo's director really saw the educational aspect of the zoo as twofold. On the one hand, teaching children about science, teaching them to love the environment, teaching them to love animals. And on the other hand, this sort of moral cultivation of their spirit, teaching them how to be good people, to follow signs, to not step on the grass, to not feed the animals. And this was open to both genders. On the other hand, in terms of zoo stories, we can look at the ways in which these popular culture artifacts assigned gender and gender roles to the different animals that lived at the zoo. So on the one hand, they're frequently anthropomorphized in terms of the heterosexual family. So we have all sorts of descriptions of mother elephants and camels and what a daddy jaguar might do. In terms of the elephant family that you can see here, at one point the elephant mom is described as a blushing bride. and the birth of the baby elephant, which is actually the first elephant to be born in the world in captivity and survive, is given a pretend baptism ceremony. And so we see the ways that this sort of traditional heterosexual family is reinforced through the zoo. And we can actually see this. This is from one of the zoo visitors. It's a postcard, and it's a picture of the mother elephant and the baby. And it says, "Darling baby, imitate Fua," who's the baby elephant, "who doesn't go out to go around without her mother." Right? And then it says, "Be careful with robbers" at the bottom. So here we've got somebody sending this postcard, right? Probably jokingly saying, hey, be like the baby elephant and stick close to your mom. So again, gender getting negotiated here. Onelli and contemporary Onelli, the director, and other observers didn't limit it just to gender roles, but they also decided to use the zoo to talk about feminism in both big and little ways. So just to give you a couple of examples in a little way, this is the famous chimpanzee Moritz that came to the Americas with the Hagenbeck circus. And Hagenbeck was a very important German animal importer, zoo mogul, essentially. And so he had a circus that actually came to Argentina, and the director of the zoo was invited to interview this chimpanzee. And the paper sends out a photographer. And you can see here it says, "A few days ago, our photographer went to say hi to him. The monkey made him drink abundant whiskey and eat chocolates. He also praised the climate of the Congo, declared himself a feminist, and said that everything in life is a party," right? So again, is this particularly consequential? Probably not. But the fact that we're assigning feminism or adhering to feminism to this traveling monkey shows us the ways that these ideas of sort of human life and animal life are intertwined. And then just to finish up here with one more example, this is actually something written by the zoo director himself in the scientific journal that the zoo put out. But he also had a satirical column in the scientific journal, which was about zoo social life. And so in 1910, he writes, "Feminism forever," and the forever is in English in the original too. And it says, "At the zoological level, we also have feminists. We have our Duchesses d'Uzi, which is, she was a French duchess who was very into the feminist movement in the early 20th century, and gentlemen who self-sacrifice for the noble cause. 4 ostrich families have started this great movement so characteristic of the 20th century. 8 female ostriches, busy worldly women who, driven by physiological necessity, had a moment of weakness for their 4 respective husbands, laid 8 or 10 eggs in the middle of their corral. They refused to incubate them, and the males understood that paternal responsibility isn't just empty words. Each collected their 16 eggs and solemnly declared the rights of women and themselves broody. And there they stayed under the lashing rain while the females took jobs in the Ministry of Agricultural Defense as locust hunters." So again, we see here using these zoo animals to comment on the feminist movement of the day. So I don't know that I yet have found enough to make any strong conclusions about how these materials are being used. It seems pretty clear to me that the director himself supports the idea of scientific and civil education or civic education for both genders, and that women should be incorporated. Women should be allowed to become teachers, scientists, things like that. But it also seems pretty clear through numerous articles that he wrote that he still does believe that first and foremost, women are mothers, and that is the job that they should take up. And that feminism is perhaps pushing them a bit too far away from that. But I don't yet know exactly how everyone else is reacting to and using these images. So that's where I'm working towards next. Well, thank you very much. And I am going to turn it over to Tara.
Thanks so much. I will show a couple of slides as well. Okay. Thanks, Ashley. And thanks so much to everyone for coming. I didn't expect this many people this late in the term. So that's wonderful. So my slides, I only have a few slides, and they are probably a little less exciting than some of Ashley's great photographs. So I'm going to move us back in time a little bit. I work on 19th century British literature and culture, and I'm moving us back to 1859. So I want to talk about a moment in 1859 in England with the appearance of 2 very different publications. So the first on the left is Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. It's published in late November of that year and considered to be the foundation of evolutionary biology. In it, Darwin introduces his concepts of natural selection and evolution. So the second text that you can see an image of on the right is Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White. This was serialized in Charles Dickens's periodical All the Year Round in the very same month, actually, of that year, in November of 1859. It was considered to be the foundation of what would be called sensation fiction. And in it, Collins introduces new styles of narration. He uses multiple narrators. It's a sort of detective novel in many ways. And he also introduces a new style of writing, again, sensationalist. So I want to ask, again, in about 6 to 8 minutes here, I want to ask, what do these two publications have in common? So this is really what I'll try and answer today. And it's sort of the cornerstone of my second book project, which is on sensation fiction and the history of affect and emotion. So I'll talk just about Darwin first. So I'm showing you some images here from Punch magazine, a satirical Victorian magazine. I always like to show these when I'm teaching Darwin as well, because the Victorians do have such a reputation, which is not totally unearned, but a reputation of being very earnest. But these are good examples, I think, of the ways in which, yes, Origin of Species certainly shocked a lot of 19th century readers, but also it was something that they poked fun at, their own reaction, that is. So what Darwin did by publishing on the Origin of Species was sort of force the Victorian public to grapple with their relationship to animals. And here's where Ashley's useful summary, I think, of us thinking through animals and animals as metaphor becomes really useful to me. So one of the sort of questions raised by this was, how do we differentiate ourselves then from, say, monkeys in particular, from apes? From our descendants, as they're called in the first slide. So a lot of people in this moment are asking, do human beings really have free will? Are we more than our instincts or impulses? What differentiates man from animal? I mean, people are also asking at this time, this is the rise of industrialism, what differentiates man from machine as well? So I want to sort of situate sensation novels and Darwin's Origin of Species within a larger public debate about humans and free will, because the concept of free will was really vital for the Victorians on religious, on ethical, on economic grounds. So why? I think it's best understood as a sort of response to a myriad of cultural and technological changes that seem to sort of coalesce in this moment, in this year, and in the years following too. So in this year, by the way, 1859 is also when John Stuart Mill publishes On Liberty, is when Samuel Smiles publishes what is called the first self-help book, just called Self-Help. So all of these are deeply invested in individual will, self-control, and again, questions of free will. So really what happens is human beings now had to sort of demonstrate what makes them distinct from both animal and machine, as a likeness to either could risk suggesting that their behaviors are more instinctual or mechanical than perhaps they would like to think. And again, I'm situating this both in Darwinism and also in industrialism. So to give you one quick example from Darwin, in a chapter on instinct, he stresses the manner in which the lives of humans and animals, always, are dictated by unconscious habitual actions that are often in direct opposition, he says, to our conscious will. Also, I think it's important to note that too, in the sort of contrast to the weight placed on the individual at this time, Darwin emphasizes the interdependence of all beings, noting that, and this is another quick quote from him, that each species has been independently created, that this view is erroneous. Okay. And what I want to suggest is that 19th century sensation novels, and this is another image from Punch magazine of a young woman reading, actually promote a similar vision of the world. So sensation novels emerge in 1859 into the 1860s as a hugely popular novelistic form in England. They were considered to be pretty scandalous reading material. They were called sensation novels both because of the plots of these novels, that they were very, very melodramatic, very sensational, sort of precursor perhaps to contemporary soap opera forms. Often focused on a particular mystery or a secret, and usually it was a sort of innocent-looking Victorian housewife who happened to harbor a dark secret. They were also called sensation novels, though, and this is, I think, more important for the point I want to make, because they were thought to encourage physical sensations in the bodies of the readers. So in other words, they really challenged what Victorians thought novels should and could do. So they challenged the idea that reading fiction should be a sort of edifying, educational experience. And instead, reading sensation novels, which were really fast-paced, very plot-driven, filled with shocks and surprises, and in fact, some commentators compared them to the experience of riding on a train, that this sort of novel reading was one driven by impulse, and was deeply embedded in the body rather than in the mind. And so I also want to suggest that the novels themselves, not just these sort of shock publications about them, the novels themselves encourage this way of thinking about the world. One character from Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White is quoted as saying, "Mind, they say, rules the world, but what rules the mind? The body." So it's really like this idea that these characters, just like sensational readers, are driven by bodily affects. And this is one way in which I distinguish between emotion and affect. Emotion is something that can be named and recognized. In other words, if I say the word anger or sadness, you have an understanding of what I mean. Whereas affects are physiological, rooted in the body, and not necessarily individualized, that they are sort of transpersonal and shared. And so this understanding of a transpersonal, of a world built on interdependence, of a world in which human beings are not separate and discrete, is very similar, in fact, to the sort of world view that Darwin articulates in Origin of Species. It's also worth noting, I think, that the reviews of these novels noted that they appealed to the animal part of our nature. And so what I want to suggest, and these are just a couple of the quotations in response to sensation novels, is that both Origin of Species and this popular, very feminized form of sensation fiction forced people in the 1860s and starting in 1859 in England to really grapple with questions of free will, of affect, and of the particular role of the human. So this famous quotation from Henry James about Wilkie Collins, that he brought in mysteries that are at our own doors, tells me something about the way in which both Darwin and sensation novelists encourage the British public to engage in a sort of self-reflection, again, on will and the sort of limits of human independence. I'll stop there, but maybe in the Q&A too, I also want to I sort of want to challenge myself by questioning the way in which I risk putting sensation novels in the context of Darwinism to sort of legitimate them, which is something I'm not trying to do, but I'm happy to talk a little bit further about them, because I do think they've been ignored as serious literature for too long, and they're very much worthy of study on their own accord. But I'll stop now and turn it over to Becca.
Thank you so much for that, Tara. I'm in awe of both of your amazing sources and material. This is so fantastic. So what I'm going to do is admit that I've had an idea for a research project for a very long time and have not been able to make it happen. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the smaller things I am working on currently that have to do with my former project, and then what I would like to do in the future when any of you all decide to just give me some money and buy me out of teaching so that I can do this project. So my name is Rebecca Scofield, and I am in the history department, and my book, Outriders, Rodeo at the Fringes of the American West, was an entire book about animals that rarely mentioned animals. And at the end of that project, sort of looking at all the human communities that participate in rodeo and the violence of it, I often talked about animals in terms of that violence, in terms of performers who were injured. But the sort of deeper emotional connections that rodeoers often frame themselves as having, or in contrast, the way in which animal rights organizations fought against rodeo as inherently abusive, a lot of those debates didn't make it into my book. And it was in that sort of final, page proofs moment when I was like, oh yeah, I should have definitely talked about this. That seems like an oversight. So what I've been working on lately is sort of filling in some of that interest into rodeos and stock shows. So the first thing I've been working on has been looking at the junior market steer auction at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. So the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo is a massive month-long rodeo carnival stock show, and it's really one of the main places that if you participate in an agrarian club like FFA or 4-H, you would hope that your animal would end up in the winners arena at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. So I'm looking at this in a way of how essentially at the stock auction, a student can sell their champion steer for over $600,000, and of that, the winner gets to keep $80,000, and the rest of the donation is then given out into scholarships. So a lot of this sort of charity is, and the way in which the stock show is framed is around education and allowing underprivileged rural kids the opportunity to access education. And I will say actually that my spouse, that's actually how he attended college, was by winning Champion Pig for like 10 years in a row in Emmett, Idaho. So I know the very real benefits of this model of funding individual education for certain students. But what I am trying to get at is how this language around being sort of civic minded and investing in a particular future for Texas's youth is actually really grounded in sort of legacies of racialized land loss for Native, Tejano, and Black communities in the state, and that many barriers still exist for young people of color to either participate in 4-H in Texas writ large, and certainly to win one of these major stock shows that would earn them money. So for instance, one of the winners recently cost about $35,000 is what the family paid to buy the animal. So obviously that's a pretty big capital investment to begin with, on top of the thousands needed for medicine, feed, grooming equipment, travel equipment, time off for parents to travel with their kids to stock shows to show the animals, and the way in which this continues to disenfranchise certain people and prevent them from gaining this kind of personal investment in their education. And this is happening, the sort of donations and the civic pride Houston donors are touting is increasing at the same time that in Texas, you have a defunding of public institutions by the state legislature, sparking a 387% rise in tuition rates at Texas A&M between 1998 and 2018. So even as we see more individual investment, you could argue, in student scholarships, it's not resulting in larger opportunities for a lot of students because those costs are going up due to neoliberal policies that defund public education. So that's a big part of it. My other part sort of takes a biopolitics argument in which these performances are ultimately about disciplining young bodies and their relationships to animals. So for instance, one news article explained to non-4-H people that, quote, students frequently grow fond of the livestock they nurture to ideal market weight. that makes sense if you're spending upwards of 5 hours a day with an animal to groom them and feed them and make sure they're deeply cared for, that you would have these relationships. And ultimately, the sale of stock in this arena is framed as a form of rural sacrifice, or what rural sociologist Coulter Ellis has called boundary labor, which he describes as beef producers' ability to, quote, separate cattle physically and emotionally from the products derived from their bodies. This separation becomes part of the beef product. So this is ultimately a performance of racialized rural labor, and young people are trained in sort of industrialized behaviors with animals as a way to earn investment in their future education, and prove that they are worthy of that education. So that's one project I'm working on. The other is a follow-up to my book project, which included a chapter on gay rodeo. I actually didn't have opportunity in the book project to really talk about the role of royalty, sort of gay rodeo queens and kings in the International Gay Rodeo Association. So one thing that has specifically to do with animals in this project is that in order to compete for a miss, which is someone who identifies as male but is dressed in female style drag, or a Mr. or Ms., all of these titles were pioneered in the 1980s. So we have a sort of emphasis on cisgender people in the Ms. and Mr. categories, and then a space for men who want to participate in drag. It's not till much later we see drag kings get incorporated into the circuit. But initially, when this was created in the 1980s, you essentially have the Ms. and the Mr. categories are made to participate in horsemanship as part of the competition. And this is really framed as being that they are part of the rodeo. So as one person said, more likely than not, the Mr. and Ms. are held by people who are active participants in the rodeo. The Miss is viewed more as a performer of all the entertainment that takes place at the rodeo. And so we can see already there is a sort of mismatch between gendered expectations of what the Miss competitors are able to do. This really doesn't make any sense because you have cisgender females going out and rodeoing. That's sort of the basis of the International Gay Rodeo Association, is that they allow women to rough stock ride. And then on top of that, you have several individuals who are winning a Mr. title one year and then a Miss title the next year. And so the question became, why can't they do horsemanship in drag if they can do it out of drag? And so this rule was changed in 1994 and stayed for almost, 22 years until 2016. We see a big hit to IGRA's to their membership in the aughts in the 2000s. And one of the ways that royalty seeks to change this and get more people involved is allowing people to choose. And yet the gendered perceptions of who would want to do horsemanship maintain. You see one person say, the males, they would rather do horsemanship than do entertainment, because entertainment is usually not a lot of Misters' fortes. They would rather do horsemanship. And yet as soon as they got rid of the requirement to do horsemanship, nobody did horsemanship because it's really hard and nobody wanted to lose. Several Misters were like, well, that's just going to tank my overall score, so I'm not going to risk it. I'm just going to do entertainment. But we see the ways in which these gendered perceptions around gendered expectations persist even when they don't match up to reality. So then finally, my dream project that I'm totally going to get to very soon. I just really want to write a chapter or an article or something called Riding Astride Equines, Bovines, and Dragons. That's just really what I want to do with my time, whenever I get it. I want to sort of approach 20th century popular fiction and looked at the ways in which in the United States, these human-animal relationships are being imagined and how those sort of contribute to a larger discourse about social frustrations, fears, hopes. And I particularly want to tease apart the sort of racialized, sexualized, and gendered meanings of human-animal relationships. So for instance, as we see here, there's been a persistent, since Tarzan and Jane and much before that as well, but there has always been a perception of white women being able to tame apes, but that taming is also somewhat sexually suspect, as we see here in this Far Side cartoon, where I am presuming to be wife ape picks a hair off her husband ape and says, well, another blonde hair, conducting a little more research with that Jane Goodall tramp. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack there. I have also seen that when other people were upset about this image, Jane Goodall actually wrote an introduction for the next Far Side book, kind of defending it and saying, I did not take offense. But I do think it gets at that sort of notion that white women are gentle tamers, but also potentially, the mothers of minotaurs. And at the same time, the way in which, so white women's relationships to animals are always morally suspect, whereas African-American women have always been portrayed as bestial themselves. And sort of teasing apart the ways in which that rhetoric plays into civil rights and second wave feminism, and how women are treated both as potential, mothers of monsters or monsters themselves. So there's a lot I need to dig into. I just have tons of books on my shelves. And if anyone wants to, further the cause, tell me what to read in my spare time that I don't have. So I will stop there. I'm sure I talked too long. But we would really like to open it up to anyone who has questions and sort of trying to bring these three threads together. So please ask away.
Thank you for that informative and in some ways provocative presentation. And I'm just all over the map in terms of the different threads and how what holds them all together is this human connection with animals. And I love the Thomas Nash cartoon and the Gary Larson cartoon, and just the ways that popular culture and journalism have interacted with this animal culture over the centuries. And I would welcome anyone in the audience who would like to just unmute themselves. And I see Stefan Flores with his hand up. So Stefan, please jump in. And while he's asking,
great.
If others would like to put questions into chat, I'd be glad to relay them as well. So go ahead.
First, just to express how wonderful it is to hear and see these wonderful presentations and intersecting lines of inquiry and engagement. With Kenton's invitation to try to think of something that might possibly cross all three presentations, at least somewhat, it makes me think back to being a tween and early teen. I mean, what was I reading then? Well, among what I was reading was I was a big fan of the Tarzan series of novels and a big fan of Louis L'Amour Westerns. And when I think back to both of those frameworks, of course, the great apes occupy the Tarzan series, as well as the racialized depictions of natives in Africa, or even the servant who helps Jane Porter's family, who is Black and repeatedly fainting, but also Tarzan's deep bonds with his ape mother. So that's one framework, you know. And then of course with Louis L'Amour, very sententious, aphoristic, you know, principles of conduct for men and women, but also horses, definitely, right? And I suppose the indigenous Native Americans that they encounter. I think back to The Quick and the Dead, which is like a retelling of Shane, right? Early 70s. So I wonder if these forms of popular fiction, if there's any riffing in your minds now to think back about these depictions of, I suppose Tarzan was a year after, for example, that Buenos Aires Zoo exhibit, right? 1912 was when Tarzan was published. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, one thing I was thinking about during our conversations, as I was listening to Rebecca and to Tara, and then with your question, is that we've all hit upon this relationship between humans and animals, and particularly apes come up frequently, as you said, and, you know, what are the points of contact and what aren't? And I was thinking about how in some cases, like in what Tara was talking about, it's very much about trying to reinforce those boundaries between man and ape and prove like we are not apes, we are more than that. Whereas in the cases of what I was talking about, and then in some of the sort of racialized, sexualized things that Becca was talking about, it's about what are those points of contact? How are we like the apes? And I think maybe what we can do with that is say, I think it, from the perspective of the sort of white, colonial, probably male subject, we're okay with saying these are the ways that apes are like us. We can put these human characteristics onto these apes. But we're not okay with saying these are the ways in which we are like apes and putting the apes' characteristics onto ourselves, right? So it's like this, there's only one direction this relationship can go, the imprinting of the human on the animal, never the animal on the human, right? I don't know if Becca or Tara, you want to answer the question more than that?
Well, yeah, I think particularly Tarzan, so Gail Biederman's Manliness and Civilization, she just briefly, like at the very end of her book, touches on Tarzan, and she does such a good job of showing the ways in which this obsession at the turn of the century, at least in the United States, with masculinity, and that Tarzan becomes in so many ways the model of masculinity in the United States, because he is like virile, like he is strong enough to battle apes and lions and all the maybe there was a dinosaur in there, I'm not sure, depending on which volume. He's strong enough to battle those things, but he always knows that he's a man, right? There's always the line in which I think that one of the key scenes is he actually kills an African, a black man, and before he devours him, he says, "No, I'm a man. I can't do that. I'm not truly an animal." And I think particularly with like King Kong and you know, all of these images of women interacting with apes and somehow convincing them, you know, like anthropomorphizing them and making them tame. It is this larger metaphor for women's being able to tame masculinity in the 20th century. And so it's very interesting. Of course, I could go on and on and on about Westerns all day long, but there is a really interesting thing about men in their horses versus women in their horses. And I really want to dive into that because I think a woman on a horse has been an image of quote unquote female empowerment for ages, and there's a lot of work emerging around horse girls and those sorts of things that I would really like to delve into, because especially in rodeo, right, that's always been like men rough stock ride, like they break broncs, and then it's like a woman and her pet pony who ride the barrels together and they're a team, and so there's a lot of really interesting stuff there, but I'll stop talking.
We've got a couple of great questions in chat, and I'll go first to Robert and then to Cadence. Robert wonders whether stories like werewolf narratives, which reverse and imprint and put animal characteristics on people, is that something that would fall within the scope of your interests. Anyone done anything
Sorry,
on werewolves?
like, I just-
Becca, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think Becca needs to take this one.
I'm sorry, I actually like told my dean recently that my book is about answering the age-old question of why do people want to sleep with werewolves? And Dean Quinlan was like, I wasn't aware this was a question. And I was like, what? What have you been reading since Twilight? No, I mean, I think that this is, yes, I would love to talk to you more about this, Robert, because it is a really big, certainly a shift in the late 20th century and into the 21st century, where now you have entire worlds built around like male wolf, like male pregnancy stories, and the whole shifter phenomenon in which very late in the century we see that deeply romanticized in a way that before, like, a werewolf would have been monstrous. It's still monstrous, but like in a hot way. I shouldn't have said that. This is being recorded. But anyways, yes, I think there's a lot to unpack about the sort of fantasy of taking on animal characteristics, and sort of the Beauty and Beast narrative is pretty prolific.
It's a good example too, I think, Becca, of what Ashley was talking about, right? With the, with my examples from 19th century literature in England in particular, and the ways in which, the boundaries are constantly being reasserted or reinforced, right? And how we're seeing both of you talk about the sort of more messy intersections of some of these boundaries, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it also goes back to what I brought up as one of the sort of overarching characteristics of our talks, which is this idea that popular culture, while dismissed, right? I mean, Becca, you're telling the story of these, I'm going to say ridiculous, right there, building into this sort of dismissing of this popular culture, these really strange sounding werewolf romances, things like that. And we're all giggling about it, right? But really, who's getting the readers, right? These werewolf stories that are asking us to think these questions, whether we're doing it intentionally or not, about where the boundaries are between the human and the animal, how we relate to animals, whether animals are metaphors, does an animal itself have, agency? Can an animal do something? And yeah, people are getting this out of werewolf romances and all of these other elements of pop culture, like the sensationalist fiction or, these crazy magazine articles about the zoo.
We have a question from Cadence for Dr. Scofield. Are gay rodeos like regular rodeos, but just aimed at giving spots to members of the LGBTQ community to compete, or are there differences in how they're staged and promoted and attended?
Yeah, so for the most part, gay rodeos are, you still have speed events, you still have rough stock events. The two major components are women and men can compete in either. I will say there's still binary categories. You have to choose what to compete for, and women still have smaller purses because they have they have fewer competitors. And then also there are an entire group of events called camp events that are really based on, what people who would have gone to rodeos would call local events. But they have put a sort of twist on it and sanctioned them, unlike the PRCA. So those include wild drag race, goat dressing, and steer deco. So lots, and those are perceived to be like the fun events that make gay rodeo gay. So goat dressing is like putting a pair of briefs on a goat, which we could discuss pretty deeply in the context of this talk. And then wild drag race includes someone in female style drag, whether they're a man or a woman, female style drag, mounting a steer and riding it across the line. So there are some differences, and it is an amateur rodeo, so anyone can enter, and they have very strict non-discrimination policies.
While we're waiting for other questions from the audience, I've got a question for, sorry, is there another hand up? I'm not.
Jen Liddy,
I've got a question, if that's all right.
So,
Hi, everyone.
Okay, go ahead. I'm not in the gallery view. Go ahead, Jen, please.
Sure. Thanks for hosting, Kenton. Thanks you all for these delightful presentations. I am very much intrigued. And I have a question about what might tie these together as someone who's sort of dabbled in critical animal studies over the years, but sort of haven't kept up with it as well as maybe you all have in the past handful of years. And so I'm curious, I'm curious if it's maybe affect that is the thing that's tying your work together that's a little bit new. You know, animal studies scholars, you know, Donna Haraway and many others have asked for a long time about these boundaries between human and other animals, the racial and gendered and sexualized aspects of that, I think have been well mined over the years, but I wonder how adding affect into the conversation might change the field of animal studies and maybe affect studies as well. So maybe this is a question for Dr. MacDonald, but any of you might have thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. I can get us started anyway. I will say too, when we were talking about sort of the terms that unite all of us, and I felt like my own talk was more about affect than animals, maybe. I think gender certainly unites all of our topics as well, but it wasn't as alliterative. So I went with affect and animals, which is sort of a joke, but sort of true. I think, yeah, I'd be curious actually to hear what Ashley and Becca say, because it's so much on the forefront of my mind to think about affect and these sort of intimacies that we're talking about. But I think you both commented on this in interesting ways. Like, I think, again, for me, I don't know that much about the state of critical animal studies today either. I think I am using animals in a sense still as sort of background for really what I'm really talking about are human beings and their emotions. But I think I'm not going to answer for you, Becca and Ashley, but what I heard in your talks too is, you know, Becca talking about the sort of bond between these students and their animals. And to me, that's so deeply about affect and emotion. And I kept thinking about Ashley's use of the phrase cultivating the spirit of the masses and what the spirit means in that context. Because it's sort of like, you know, as Jen and I talk about a lot, affect is very hard to define, right? It's people use it as synonymous with like atmosphere or a sort of essence, or, you know, there's so many synonyms we can draw because it is difficult to put into language. But I thought spirit could be an interesting way of getting to some sort of communal affective state.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me, I guess. Affect is not something that I've thought about a whole lot. And I think in the case of the text that I'm looking at, when they're talking about spirit, they're sort of talking about this national identity, like who we are, who is Argentina and what is Argentina. And I think in some ways that does connect to what you're talking about. To me, the interesting part in terms of like the relationship to critical animal studies, like you're saying, is that in terms of zoo studies, at least, the vast majority of the scholarship has come out of English-speaking contexts, or at the very least imperial contexts. So, you know, England, the United States, Germany, and Japan, basically. And there's been very little done on how do zoos function and what is the purpose of zoos and how do zoos work within the wider society when you're not looking at the zoo as a reflection of imperial pretensions or holdings or something like that, right? And so Argentina is a country that was not imperial and was really trying to cement its own boundaries at the time and negotiate its own relationship to its own territories. And so there's a lot of that in the materials that I'm looking at too, these questions of, you know, what's the relationship to indigenous people and fauna? Is it better to have exotic imported species, i.e. immigrants, or to have native species in your zoo? And so to me, that's the really interesting part is looking at this as, yeah, you know, how does this overlap with what's already been done in these imperial and mostly US speaking contexts? And how is a country like Argentina, or honestly, Brazil, Mexico, I mean, most of the Latin American countries had zoos at this time. How is that fundamentally different or fundamentally the same?
Yeah, and I think, so for me, affect is particularly important for the performance studies aspect. Like as Tara was getting at, how do students feel? How does that emotional labor that they are doing within 4-H or FFA make them worthy of an education in a way that students who are not doing that emotional labor and making the hard sacrifice, how does that sort of make the difference for these students? And then on the fiction side of things, to be very honest, yeah, I mean, this is like, I have like stacks of critical animal studies to read. And of course, I'm familiar with like Donna Haraway in terms of gender and all of that. And there is a part of me that wants to dive into the secondary literature to make sure I'm not just like rehashing. But thus far, what I've read, a lot of what I have read has come out of a literary studies framework, which is fantastic when you're looking at sort of analyzing themes and those sorts of things. But as a cultural historian, I really want to put that in the context, like what are the real world impacts of this literature? I'm not saying that like policy gets written because somebody, like watched King Kong, but it is definitely contributing to wider discourses about masculinity, about what men should be able to do to women, about women's roles in the world, and who different racial groups are, and particularly to just the heteronormativity of it all. And so I really want, there's some really great collections of popular fiction at like Cornell that are queer pulp fiction and things like that. And I would love to see how that's playing in. So I think that affect is hugely important to my performance studies, and I'm very interested to see how it will play into this project that I'm totally gonna do in just a minute.
Thank you all so much. I look forward to talking with you more.
I'd like to ask a question of Ben James, who's in the audience today. And Ben, you put in the title of a Swedish film, Border or Gorons. And I wondered if you just might describe that film and whether you'd recommend it for those of us interested in cinematic depictions of human-animal relationships.
Yeah, thanks, Kenton. Not expecting to be a surprise guest in this colloquium. Border. So yeah, Border. It's Swedish. Yeah, it's not a human. I don't know. I don't want to spoil it for anyone because I don't want to give too much away. But it does not. It doesn't feature a human animal relationship, but there are some human characters in the film who are maybe more animal than human, maybe. So that's pretty interesting, and the portrayals in it are fantastic. The practical effects, I'm a big fan of practical effects, are superb. The acting is great. It's quite heartrending. Not for the faint-hearted, but it is a fascinating film. There's some really interesting gender fluidity in it too. Check it
out. Thank you, Ben, and didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but I'm going to check out the film. So we've got another question from Zachary Turpin, and I'll let the panelists read the setup, the introduction to that. But his bottom line question is, does your research in any way find nodes of resistance to the commodification of the relationship between humans and non-human animals?
Yes, I can answer that one very quickly, Zach. So absolutely with this commodification, and one of the things I've been working on as a separate article is the fact that the director really played up the eccentric elements of his personality with these bottle feeding of babies and like parading giraffes through the streets in order to get visitors to the zoo and make these relationships very public. But the way I'm envisioning my book project is actually the first part is going to be looking at how humans are using these animals to negotiate ideas like gender and race and what or who is Argentina. But my second half, I really want to look at resistance to those narratives, both on the part of the people that these elites are talking about. So for instance, I looked at today some of the things that they said about women in feminism, but how are women in the feminist movement actually using these animals to create their own narratives of inclusion or exclusion? But then also how the animals themselves resist. So one of the things that I'm finding as I go through these materials is just how many stories there are of animals misbehaving at the zoo, breaking out of their enclosures, refusing to mate, refusing to take care of their children, dying, biting people, right? And all of these ways in which animals are actually resisting these places that they're put into and the roles that they're forced to play, whether it's intentional resistance or not. And so trying to sort of figure out, what does that mean and what level of agency and what level of participation can we assign to these animals that are in the zoo? And is there really any way out of this?
Any other panelists want to respond to that last question? If not, then I think we can go ahead and wrap up. We've gone past our 1 hour time, and it's been a very interesting and provocative, and I would say well-intended presentation. One of the best we've had all semester in terms of participation. So I think the three of you must have your own fan club that followed you here today. And I just wanted to invite our audience, if you would, those of you that haven't turned on your cameras yet, to give our three panelists a virtual round of applause and let them see who's been with us today, or to put up that Zoom wave of applause. So I hope that we can revisit this topic maybe in a year or so as we move forward. Thank you, Sarah, for showing us your feline companion who has taken this all in.
Milo was very interested the whole time.
Good. I had Lucy on my lap most of the time, and during Tara's talk, she sunk her claws into my leg. So I don't know what that means, Tara, for what you were saying.
That's the effect I usually have. So
there's the note of resistance, right?
So I hope you will all join us next week for a presentation with Joanna Goss from Art and Design, and a collaborator looking at some of the images of nuclear testing and their cultural significance. And I would invite those of you who are have not previously presented to the colloquium. We're collecting names for next fall, and feel free to nominate yourself or suggest someone else who would be a good speaker for this series. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Happy April, stay well, stay safe, and see you next Tuesday.